So apparently a homeowner association is threatening to evict tenants and or property owners for conducting commercial business in their residential units during the coronavirus lockdown. Which has a lot of people asking, is this legal? Is this wrong? To which I respond,
am I wrong?
You're not wrong.
HOA.
You're just an asshole.
Viva Frei, Montreal litigator turned YouTuber, entering week 5 of the My Coronavirus lockdown in Canada, which means it's time for another car vlog. So what is going on in this particular situation? The other day, I think it was yesterday, and I think it was in Facebook DMs, but I received a DM to the effect that a homeowners association had sent a letter of demand threatening to evict residential tenants and even property owners for conducting commercial business on their residential properties during the My Coronavirus lockdown. The original thread on the subject apparently appeared in Reddit and was apparently verified by the moderators as far as accuracy goes, and I believe it occurred in the state of Tennessee, but it really doesn't matter. It doesn't actually matter if this occurred in the specific state of Tennessee. It doesn't actually matter if the letter of demand that we are going to read from the Homeowners Association is in fact a legitimate letter of demand. The letter itself could in fact be fake or could be drafted by somebody as a joke, but it doesn't change anything as relates to the law on homeowners associations and to the potential plausibility of the letter of demand itself. First things first, what is a homeowners association, or what is more frequently referred to as an HOA? Simply put, an HOA is a contract entered into by property owners that govern communal living. It can apply to neighborhood settings, but typically we are more familiar with the HOA structure as relates to co-ops or condos. And basically it sets out rules, it sets out obligations, it sets out financing certain common areas, etc., etc. They can restrict the type of structures you can erect on your property, the types of modifications you can make to your property. If there are common areas such as elevators, gardens, private roads that might exist within the community, they can govern how those are financed, how those are maintained, etc., etc. And one of the most fundamental restrictions we pretty much always see in these HOA bylaws or condominium bylaws is the prohibition or restrictions on the types of commerces individuals can operate within their residential units. And the reason for this is pretty obvious. Community members don't necessarily want commercial foot traffic running through their condominium, their co-op, or their neighborhood. And the more condensed the living quarters, typically the more justifiable these restrictions become. If you're living in a condominium setting, for example, you don't necessarily want your neighbor operating a massage parlor. And even if you're living in a bigger, more sparsely populated residential setting, you don't necessarily want your neighbor, for example, having a big cat rescue on their property. And while this admittedly all relates to private property rights, people can nonetheless willingly contract certain restrictions on their private property rights. And that is exactly what happens under these homeowner association bylaws. When you buy into properties that are governed by HOA bylaws, when you buy into a condo or a co-op, you are buying into these certain restrictions, and you need to know what those restrictions are in the bylaws before buying into them. One of a couple of anecdotes I'm going to share during this vlog, we once bought into a condo unit, as my grandmother would say, 2 times, the first and the last time. We bought a small condo in a small condo complex which was both mixed residential and commercial units. We bought it as something of an investment, and let me just tell you, it turned into the gift that kept on giving nothing. Within short order of having bought it, we quickly realized that there were massive problems and disputes among the condo owners. Disputes that were exhausting not only emotionally but also financially because they got lawyers involved. And within no time I was elected president of the condo board in the hopes that I could resolve these problems and we could once again go on with peaceful communal living. And let me just tell you something, being president of a condo board, it was a learning experience and one which I intend not to repeat. All of that to say, although this does in fact all relate to fundamental property rights, the bylaws can nonetheless legitimately restrict those property rights. Not only can they restrict those property rights, but they can in fact empower the HOA association to enforce sanctions for violating those bylaws. Those sanctions can result in the loss of rights, for example, the right to access common areas. They can result in fines or levies, and in the most extreme of circumstances, they can, in theory, result in the compelled forced sale of the property. With that said, let's now go read through that HOA letter and discuss further afterwards. 30-day notice to vacate. Dear HOA member, it has come to our attention that you are in violation of Article 7, Section 8 of our bylaws, which states, Section 8, Commercial Business. Commercial business may not be maintained or transacted on any lot or in any residential unit. We had determined that this includes any work-from-home activities and have determined through observing your activities that you are engaged in such activities. As a result of your action, we will be invoking Section 2, Article 4 of the bylaws, which allows the board to foreclose on any property that is in violation. If you are a tenant, your landlord has received this notification as well. You must vacate the premises by April 30th, 2020. If you are an owner, you or your tenants must vacate the premises by April 30th, 2020. You will still be responsible for any liens on your property, including mortgages. Failure to comply with these demands will result in eviction proceedings. Any legal costs incurred by the HOA board in this matter will be placed as an additional lien on your property. Failure to vacate may also result in criminal charges, as we intend to pursue those charges to the fullest extent of the law. Sincerely. There are so many things that are utterly infuriating about this that I don't even know where to begin. But before I get into that, we must nonetheless make the effort to try to understand the argument here. The prohibition on conducting commercial activities in a residential unit is par for the course as far as these bylaws go. And what people find to be absolutely callous, heartless, and utterly oppressive is that in the era of a total lockdown, the Homeowners Association is trying to prevent people from working at home? Absolutely, on its face, that seems totally excessive. But the flip side to this is that during an era of a pandemic, people don't necessarily want commercial foot traffic running through residential units. Depending on the structure of this Homeowners Association and depending on the nature of the business that is being conducted in these residential units, you don't necessarily want strangers coming in and out, strangers who might themselves be carrying the virus. So there is a quasi-legitimate concern behind the iron fist of the president of this particular HOA. That being said, this is where a certain amount of good judgment or common sense comes into play, and unfortunately, you can't always rely on that when it comes to the board. During the time of a pandemic, you don't necessarily want to see an increase in foot traffic of strangers through residential units and common areas. Okay, and what is the way to mitigate those concerns? By evicting the tenants and foreclosing on the properties, even if you are allowed to do so under the bylaws? And this is where jurisdiction becomes critical and basically precludes any sweeping opinions on the subject, and incidentally,
nothing in this video constitutes legal advice.
At the very least, in Quebec and Canada, when it comes to commercial properties, you can have provisions in the lease that provide for extrajudicial termination of the lease. Extrajudicial termination basically means that the landlord can terminate the lease and evict the tenant without a court order because it so provides in the lease. The clauses need to be meticulously and properly drafted in order to be enforceable, but they can nonetheless be enforceable.
In the context of commercial leases.
In the context of residential leases, you cannot evict a tenant, at the very least in Quebec, without a court order. In Quebec, as far as it relates to residential properties, the tenants have what is referred to as the right to retain occupancy. And if you want to kick out a tenant on the basis of the breach of their obligations, you have to go to court to get a judgment to do that. No bailiff is going to evict a residential tenant in the absence of a court order. And even when it comes to extrajudicial termination of a commercial lease, even if there is a provision to that effect in the lease, sometimes the courts don't enforce that provision. Which brings me to my next anecdote, where I was representing a landlord who had a lease which provided for extrajudicial termination of the lease. We were in the presence of a commercial tenant who was in material breach of a number of obligations under their lease, most notably the obligation to pay rent. We sent out letters of demand, we sent out notices. Finally, one day we say we are exercising our rights under the lease for extrajudicial termination of the lease. And we called a bailiff to come and evict the tenant under the provisions of the lease so that we could change the locks and take possession of the premises again. And lo and behold, the bailiff said, no, I'm not doing any such thing in the absence of a court order. So despite having a binding lease between the parties that clearly provided for the extrajudicial termination of the lease, we had a bailiff say, no, I am not evicting that tenant in the absence of a court order because I'm not incurring my own liability here. And so what does the landlord have to do? The landlord still has to petition the court. So we take an injunction saying that the court should order the eviction of the tenant because we have this lease that provides for extrajudicial termination of the lease. And what does the judge say on the presentation of our injunction ordering the eviction of the tenant? The judge says, you want me to evict the tenant on an injunction before the tenant has had their right to a full and final hearing on the merits? To which I responded, yes, that's what we have that provision in the lease for. And then I made the cardinal rookie mistake of asking a rhetorical question to a judge. I said, if these provisions for extrajudicial termination of the lease require a judgment on the merits, what good are they? To which the judge responded in open court, and I'm not joking you, I don't know, go ask your father. All that to say, even in the context of commercial leases, the courts do not evict the tenants in the absence of a final court order. And when it comes to the property owners themselves, what are the chances that the courts are going to order the foreclosure on the property because the property owner might have breached certain bylaws? I've got to tell you, in order for a court to foreclose on the property, order the sale of that property, the breach of the bylaws has got to be a little bit more excessive than maybe conducting business out of it during a pandemic. If the business that the property owner is conducting within their premises during the time of a pandemic is, I don't know, a strip club and a bar, yes, I could potentially see the court foreclosing on their property. But even then, it requires a judgment of the court, not a letter from the president of the Homeowners Association. But the part I especially love about this letter, and it's reminiscent less so of community living and more so of actual outright communism, is the following. We had determined that this includes any work-from-home activities and have determined through observing your activities that you are engaged in such activities. So the Homeowners Association had determined, and I don't know in virtue of what power, but they had determined that the commercial activities that were prohibited included work-from-home activities. In this particular context, I have no idea what work-from-home activities means. If the homeowner is, let's just take an example, a YouTuber who makes videos from home, would that constitute work-from-home activities that are prohibited under the bylaws? And that sentence that we have determined through observing your activities, what on earth does that possibly mean? What is the actual evidence on which these observations are based? Do they have CCTV television? Do they have neighbors looking into the windows of other houses to spy on them, to rat out to the homeowners associations who's working from home? They have determined through their observations that they are judge, jury, and executioner. No need for a court date. We're just going to go ahead and take your property and sell it now. Setting aside whether or not the homeowners association could even find someone reckless enough to try to foreclose on the property of another in the absence of a court order, what are the chances that the court would sanction this type of conduct, even if it were remotely justifiable under the strictest letter of the bylaws? Hopefully we will never know, but I would predict that it's going to be closer to 0 than to 100, and I would not want to be the lawyer for the homeowners association who ever tried to act on this letter of demand. And setting aside the legal reality of all of this, there's also the practical reality as to what court is going to hear this in the era of a pandemic when everything is shut down. In Quebec and Canada, the courts are quite literally shut down, and although they are in fact nonetheless still hearing urgent matters, they are not hearing everyday matters. And as far as urgent matters go, I don't think a court is going to deem this to be sufficiently urgent to foreclose on a property during a pandemic because someone is conducting business in their own property. Not only do I not think that a court would deem this to be sufficiently urgent, I think they would come down extremely hard on anybody silly enough to take such proceedings in the time of a pandemic. The courts and the government right now are trying to prevent evictions. They're not trying to sanction evictions. And incidentally, sanction in English is one of those rare words that actually means itself and the exact opposite in the same word. You have sanctions as in a punishment and sanction as in an approval. And obviously I was using the term sanction as in an approval. Courts are not going to be sanctioning evictions for property owners who are conducting business on their own properties in the absence of the most egregious and dangerous situations. If someone in a homeowners association starts using their property to make munitions, yes, maybe that would be sufficiently urgent. But as for the rest, it is just silly to take such a position. And for those of you who've been following me for a while, you know that I often talk about the legal side of law and the human side of law. It's also silly from a human perspective. One day this pandemic is going to be over and that president of the HOA is going to have to go back to coexisting with the other members of the HOA. And let me tell you, they're probably not going to be all that happy with that community member that tried to shut down their business and foreclose on their property in the time of a pandemic. Penny wise, pound foolish, and this is how you make enemies in communal living, which is a very silly thing to do. And with that said, if you like my videos and you like my content, please be sure to like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and drop a comment in the comment section below. Let me know what you think of all of this. Is there a justification in law on the substance of this notice of foreclosure from the HOA? Yeah, in theory. Would a court ever order the eviction of a residential tenant or the foreclosure on the residential property because the owner was conducting business in it? Only in the most extreme examples conceivable. Even if there were the slightest chance of that happening, good luck finding a court who is going to deem this to be sufficiently urgent to be heard during a pandemic. And the penultimate moral of the story, when you write stupid letters like this, expect to make enemies for no good reason, and you don't get very far in life by making enemies for no good reason. There is the law, there is common sense, and there is being a human, and the best reality in which we can live is that little section where all three of those overlap. And with that said, stay safe, stay healthy, don't make enemies for no good reason, and now you know your vlog. Peace out. Booyah!